So the three reports, 287, 289, 290, are allowed for corroborative purposes. The others are admitted. Portions of 290, portions of 301, and 8990, and J6 and 7 are demonstrative exhibits. Those are allowed, subject to our prior ruling for preservation purposes. All right. Further evidence. Are there any other administrative matters we need to take up? All right. Further evidence for the legislative defendants or the defendants?
Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to call Dr. Trey Hood as our next witness. Michael Midnight. I'll do that.
If you'll please remain standing, place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hood.
Good afternoon.
Please state your full name.
M.V. Hood III.
And please describe your educational background for the court.
I don't think I got up here with my notebook.
Oh, no, well, that's a good point. If we could now, could we pass out the witness notebooks for Dr. Hood?
May I encourage your honor?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Hood, I'll ask that question again. Could you please describe your educational background for the court?
Okay, I've got 3 degrees in political science, a BS from Texas A&M, an MA from Baylor University, and a PhD from Texas Tech University.
All right, and what is your present occupation?
I'm a professor of political science at the University of Georgia.
And how long have you been a professor of political science at the University of Georgia?
August 1st of this year will be 20 years.
Are you a full professor there?
Yes.
Are you tenured?
Yes.
How long have you been tenured?
13 years, I believe.
All right. And what are your job duties as a professor of political science?
Well, I teach and conduct research, and currently I'm the director of the SPIA Survey Research Center. So I also run a SPIA, S-P-I-A, School of Public and International Affairs is what the acronym stands for, Survey Research Center. So I have some administrative duties.
All right. And what kind of research does the SPIA Center conduct?
Public opinion research.
Does it do it for any prominent entities?
The Atlanta Journal-Constitution, I think, is probably the most prominent entity we survey for.
And is it fair to say that you perform all of their polling?
We do all their political polling, yes.
Now, what kind of courses have you taught during your tenure as a professor of political science?
I've taught a variety of courses, primarily in American politics and policy. Every spring I teach a class in Southern politics. That's at the undergraduate level. I've taught courses on election administration at the graduate level, and Southern politics at the graduate level, and we have a heavy dose of, not surprisingly, voting rights and redistricting in those classes. In the past, I've taught research methods courses. I teach courses, or I have students attached to me that are interns at the Survey Research Center, so those are courses as well. So I've taught a wide variety of courses over the years, again, primarily in American politics and policy, and some undergraduate methods courses.
Do you conduct research in the area of redistricting?
Yes, I have.
Have you published articles on redistricting in peer-reviewed journals?
Yes.
And how many?
Well, 4 articles in peer-reviewed journals, and I've also got a book chapter that deals with redistricting.
How many other times has your work appeared in peer-reviewed journals?
Not certain, close to 50 at this point.
All right. And do you serve on the editorial board of any peer-reviewed journals?
Yes, I serve currently on the editorial boards for Social Science Quarterly and Election Law Journal, which deals specifically with election administration issues, including redistricting.
All right. Would you turn with me then to Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 284, your witness notebook?
Okay.
Do you recognize this document?
Yes, it's an expert report I submitted in this case.
And you submitted it on April 30th of 2019, is that right?
Correct.
All right. And would you please turn with me to the back of your report after page 21?
Okay.
Is this a copy of your CV that is current through April 30th of 2019?
Yes, it is.
All right. And is the CV current through today?
Not through today, no.
What else needs to be added?
Earlier this month, I presented research at an election administration conference. So that would be something that would be added to my CV at some point.
All right. Any other additions?
No, not that I can think of.
Now, before this case, have you testified in any other cases where your testimony was accepted as an expert witness?
Yes.
Okay. How many?
Approximately 20.
And are those cases listed on pages 1 and 2 of your report that is marked as Exhibit 284?
Well, the cases I participated in over the last 4 years, yes.
Okay.
So not every case I've ever testified in.
And among the cases that are listed on pages 1 and 2, how many also involve redistricting?
I believe 6.
All right, and that doesn't count this case?
Correct.
Okay. And among the cases in which you've been accepted as an expert, have any been in the state of North Carolina?
Yes.
Which one specifically?
United States v. North Carolina, Covington v. North Carolina, Common Cause v. Richo. I believe that's it.
All right. And have you testified on behalf of districting plans that were enacted by both Republicans and Democrats?
Yes.
And also, when I had you turn, while we're on the subject, to exhibit, this is Legislative Defendants Exhibit 285 in your notebook. Hopefully that's the next tab.
Okay.
And do you recognize this document?
Yes, it's a supplemental report I submitted in this matter.
Okay. And you submitted that on May 7th of 2019?
Correct.
All right. With that, Your Honors, we would move to tender Dr. M.V. Hood III as an expert in American politics and policy, Southern politics, quantitative political analysis, and election administration, including redistricting.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
Yes, sir. His testimony will be received as proper.
All right. Dr. Hood, thinking about your initial report from April 30th, please briefly describe what you were asked to do.
I was asked to primarily render an assessment of the 2017 North Carolina House and Senate plans that were enacted.
All right. And did you respond to any of the plaintiffs' experts?
Well, in carrying out that task, I did respond in particular to Professor Cooper and Professor Chung in part.
All right. And what is your understanding of how the redistricting process in North Carolina works?
Well, my description was it's a fairly formulaic process. Again, there were criteria laid out, and there are criteria found in the North Carolina Constitution that mandate that whole counties be utilized in the redistricting process. So counties are used as building blocks in North Carolina. And so the idea is to take any county that can support at least one district and build out from there. And so you want to start out with one county groupings and then move to 2 and then to 3 and then maybe beyond that if necessary. And so then you would draw, once you had a county grouping, if the county grouping contained more than one district, you're going to have to draw a district boundary line somewhere inside that county grouping. And that again depends on how many districts, single member districts, are going to be located within the county grouping that you're looking at. But at that point, each one of these county groupings becomes essentially its own microcosm in terms of a redistricting environment. And also within a county grouping, there were mandates that county lines could not be crossed or traversed unless it was equalized population, and that could only occur once. And then layered on top of that, there were other considerations that the legislature laid out in terms of the criteria, including, of course, equalizing population, reducing VTD splits, making sure districts are contiguous, increasing to the extent possible compactness, respecting municipal boundaries to the extent possible, and protecting incumbents. So once you layer all these criteria on top of each other, again, my description was it was a fairly formulaic exercise that really limits the discretion to a large extent of map drawers.
All right. And what is your understanding of what is being challenged by the plaintiffs in this case?
My understanding is reading the complaint that allegations have been made about certain House and Senate districts in the state, specifically 77 House districts and 23 Senate districts. It's my understanding from reading the complaint that the whole county system is not being challenged, the current county grouping system is not being challenged, again, nor are necessarily all the House and Senate districts in the state being challenged.
All right. Let's look in your report first at tables 1 through 5, which are included in a section that is entitled Traditional Redistricting Criteria. And those tables are found on pages 3 through 10. And within that subset of tables, I'd like to direct your attention first to Table 1, which is also identified as Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 121, and that is located on page 4 of your report. So, what does Table 1 on page 4 show?
Well, in this section of the report, what I'm doing is I'm looking to see if certain criteria is laid out by the General Assembly for the redistricting plan were met. So this is part of it. I'm looking at the number of VTDs that were split in the 2017 enacted plans versus the 2011, what I call the benchmark plans that were in place before that. And I also make certain comparisons between the enacted plan and Professor Chen's simulated districting plans. So that's what's contained in Table 1. So again, one of the criteria called for a reduction to the extent possible in VTD splits for the enacted plan. So for instance, and again, this table contains both summary statistics for the State House and the State Senate. So for instance, the 2011 House plan, nearly 15% of VTDs were split, or 395 in terms of number, versus the 2017 House plan, which split 1.8%, or 48 VTDs. So there was certainly a reduction there. Same thing for the Senate. If you look at the Senate, in 2011, about 10%, 9.5% of VTDs in the Senate plan were split versus 1.8%, or a total of 0.2%. I was looking at the wrong number. Or 5 total were split in the 2017 enacted plan. So there were definite reductions there. Another way to sort of look at this is to say how many VTDs were kept whole Well, in the House, it's 98% or over 98%, and in the Senate, it's close to 100%. So that's another way to look at that. The bottom part of the table examines the VTD splits produced by Professor Chen's simulations. And again, there's a range on these because he reports things in ranges. So you can see there's a slight improvement over the plan that was actually enacted in terms of Professor Chen's simulations. It's my understanding that he wanted to sort of maximize that criteria. Again, the criteria is laid out by the General Assembly, didn't call for maximization and a reduction in VTD splits, just a reduction in VTD splits, which was obviously met. So Professor Chen's plan improves on this slightly, but just ever so slightly, especially for the Senate. But again, that wasn't necessarily the criteria as I understood it.
All right, let's turn then to Table 2, which is identified as Legislative Defendant's Trial Exhibit 122. Table 2 is found on page 5 of your report. How does Table 2 relate to Table 1?
Well, not all of the 27 enacted plan consisted of redrawn county groups or even redrawn districts. Only part of the plan was redrawn as mandated by the Covington Court. So again, to the extent to which you're looking at a section of the plan that was not being redrawn and it has split VTDs, it's hard to it's impossible to reduce that number in that case. So for instance, in the House, of the 48 VTD split, half of them, exactly 24 of them, were in county groupings that were carried over from the previous plan. So the map drawer in 2017 did not have an opportunity to actually go in and make reductions in VTD splits. In the Senate, 3 of 5 split VTDs were found in county groups that were carried over from the previous plan. Again, Professor Chen had the advantage when he drew his simulated maps of starting from scratch, essentially, and redrawing the whole state. So that's the point of Table 2.
All right, well, let's turn next then to Table 3, which is identified as Legislative Defendant's Trial Exhibit 123. And that one is found on page 6 of your report. What does this table show?
Table 3 and 4 go together. Table 3 is for the House of Representatives and Table 4 is for the State Senate. And both tables are looking at average compactness scores. In this case, REOC and Polsby-Popper, which are the most commonly utilized compactness scores and go way back in time. So again, the plan called, or the criteria called for, to the extent possible, that districts be made more compact over the benchmark plan. So we can make the comparisons here. For instance, looking at Table 3, under the REOC column, comparing the 2011 plan to the 2017 plan, the average REOC score goes from 0.383 to 0.414, so it increases slightly. The Polsby-Popper score for the State House, the average compactness score goes from 0.238 to 0.320, so it's increasing slightly. And then in Table 4, if we can flip over there real quickly, and then I'll come back and say some things about the comparisons of Professor Chen's simulated districting plans. But again, same thing for Table 4. The 2011 plan, the average REOC score was 0.379. It increases to 0.428 in the enacted plan. The Polsby-Popper score, the average Polsby-Popper score for the Senate was 0.258. It increases to 0.348 in the enacted plan. So at the bottom of both Tables 3 and 4, I also make comparisons, again, to Professor Chen's simulations. And again, these are reported in ranges. So you can see again, and again, it's my understanding that Professor Chen was attempting to maximize this criteria. That's not what the criteria that the General Assembly wrote called upon the map drawers to do. They didn't have to maximize compactness, just increase compactness to the extent possible. So there are slight gains in compactness made in his plans over the enacted plan. That's true. And you can see the differences there in the bottom panels of Tables 3 and 4. And before I forget, the criteria as drawn by drawn up by the General Assembly also called for certain threshold levels to be covered for compactness scores. So compactness for any single district shouldn't drop below a certain level using Polsby-Popper or REOC. So those values were 0.116 for REOC and 0.06 for Polsby-Popper. And I examined the districts as they were enacted, and none of the districts in the House or Senate breached this threshold level. So they were all above this sort of minimum level set out in the criteria. So I could report that also.
All right, let's look next at Table 5, which is identified as Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 125. I believe that's found on page 9 of your report. What does Table 5 show?
So again, another one of the criteria as laid out by the General Assembly was an attempt to prevent incumbents from being paired together, so an incumbency protection plan, essentially. And Table 5 looks to see how well this goal was met for the House and Senate. Now, the reason there's a 2017 enacted column and a 2018 elections column is because after the plan was enacted in 2017, there were slight alterations made by a special master to the plan. So just for full information purposes, I've laid everything out here for both of those plans. In the House, the 2017 plan, 96.7% of incumbents were unpaired, which is a pretty high number. In the Senate, for the 2017 enacted plan, it's a little bit lower, but still high. It's 84%. And then you can look at the table and see where incumbents were paired, who was paired against each other. So, for instance, a DR means a Democratic-Republican pairing. So in the 2017 enacted plan, there was one Democrat paired against one Republican. As well in the Senate, same thing. There were no Democrats paired against each other in the 2017 enacted plan in the House or the Senate. There were a number of Republicans that were paired against one another, though, in one set in the House and 3 sets in the Senate. So that's how things parsed out in terms of looking to see whether these plans paired incumbents or not. And again, it's my opinion that the plan accomplished that criteria.
So if there were any additional incumbent pairings between the 2017 enacted plan and the plan that was used in the 2018 elections, that was the result of the work of the special master?
Correct, and that's why those columns are included in the table.
How does the 2017 enacted House and Senate plans, how do they compare with the adopted criteria that you looked at?
Well, it's, in my opinion at least, I think the 2017 enacted House and Senate plans comport fairly well with the criteria as laid out by the General Assembly. Again, we've gone through a number of metrics that we've talked about. The fact that the whole county grouping system was in place means, and the limited traversal rule was in place, means that county boundaries were protected. So communities of interest are being recognized and protected. Within the safe harbor, the plus or 5% population deviation, all the districts meet that goal. All the districts are contiguous. They're single member. Again, VTD splits were reduced. Incumbents were not paired against one another. Compactness was slightly increased. So in my opinion, I think the 2017 enacted House and Senate plans do a fairly good job of meeting the criteria as laid out by the General Assembly.
Now, the next section of your report has a heading entitled The 2018 Election, and it contains tables 6 through 10. What did you cover in this section of your report?
Well, I looked at what happened. I guess you could say tables 6 and 7 go together to a large extent. 6 is sort of where things were prior to the 2018 election in terms of partisan seat share in the House and Senate. And then table 7 looks to see what happens after the 2018 elections. So I wanted to look and see, the plan was in place for the 2018 elections. I wanted to look and see what happened and what happened where. So that's what these tables are dealing with here.
All right, so why don't we look at, pull up table 6 and 7, and table 6 is legislative defendants trial exhibit 126, and table 7 is legislative defendants trial exhibit 127. And I believe that both of those tables are found on page 11 of your report. Is that right?
Yes.
Again, what do these tables show? What does the data show?
So Table 6 again shows the seat distribution by party prior to the 2018 elections. So where did things stand prior to the 2018 elections? There were 74 Republicans and 46 Democrats in the House, and 35 Republicans and 15 Democrats in the Senate. So then if you go down to Table 7, you can see what happens after the election occurs. So statewide, and again, I'm sure many in this room are probably familiar with these figures at this point, but the Republicans still have a majority. They have 65 seats versus 55 for the Democrats in the House. And in the Senate, the Republicans have 29 seats versus 21 for the Democrats. So there are definite seat pickups by the Democrats in both the House and the Senate. And then I have things divided up into a couple of different rows. Challenge districts, so these are the districts mentioned or which allegations were mentioned by in the complaint. Challenge groups, so a challenge group would be any grouping that has a challenge district encapsulated within it, whether or not all the districts are challenged or not. And then non-challenge districts, districts outside of these challenge groups. So we can look to see what happens within these various geographic regions here. So in the challenge districts, the Republicans won 49.4% of those districts versus 50.6% in the House. And in the Senate, the Republicans won 43.4% versus 56.5% for the Democrats in the Senate. In challenge groupings, or the challenge groups in the House, the numbers are almost synonymous. 48.8% Republican seat share in that category versus 51.2% for the Democrats. The challenge groups and challenge districts are synonymous in the Senate. That's why there's no figures there. For the non-challenge districts, the Republicans run up much larger majorities here, 65.8%, so nearly two-thirds, and 70.4% in the Senate for the non-challenge districts.
All right, let's look next at Table 8, which is identified as legislative defendants trial exhibit 128, and that is on page 13 of your report. What do you show in Table 8?
Okay, tables 8 and 9 to some degree go together, but we'll talk about them one at a time. I created a partisan vote index like many have done. In this particular case, I used quite a few elections, ranging from statewide contested elections ranging from 2008 to 2016. And 25 statewide races go into this index, so it's quite comprehensive. And so I had those data down to the block level. I rebuilt up to the district level so I could look at what was the partisan composition of, using this index at least, of these House and Senate districts. And then I could I've come up with a categorization which I've used before, in which mirrors what we know and use oftentimes in political science about what are safe and competitive seats. So on this case, this is the Republican share of the two-party vote ranging from 0 to 100. So any district that was coded 0 to 45 would be strong Democrat, 45 to 50 would be competitive but Democratic leaning, 50 to 55% would be competitive but Republican leaning, and 55+% would be strong Republican. So using this categorization in tables 8 and 9, I looked to see what happened with the election results. So for instance, if you look at table 8, this is for the state house, strong Democratic seats, the Democrats won all of those seats, 100%, 27 to 27. In the competitive Democratic range, Democrats win 3/5 or 60% of those seats. Somewhat surprisingly, though the Democrats are also able to capture a third of the competitive Republican seats and 15% of the strong Republican seats. And the Republicans were not able to win any of the strong Democratic seats, at least as coded there. So if you look at Table 9, this is the same table but for the state Senate using the same categorization scheme. So again, the Democrats win 100% of the seats coded as strong Democrat. There are no seats in this particular iteration that are competitive but Democratic leaning. So that's why the zeros are there. They win a third of the competitive Republican seats and a fifth or 20% of the strong Republican seats. So, I mean, this shows you a couple of things. One, the Democrats in 2018 in North Carolina in both the State House and State Senate elections were able to make inroads in the districts which we would think would be, in some cases, even fairly solidly Republican. It also goes to show that, again, I'm using a partisan vote index of votes obviously prior to the 2018 elections. Sometimes it does a fairly good job of making predictions, and sometimes the partisan vote index doesn't do a good job of making predictions. It's right more often than it's wrong, but there's still an error rate in trying to make this prediction. Sometimes making predictions in any line of work obviously is fraught with a little bit of peril. So those are some points from this particular section here of my report.
All right. Now, you just mentioned the fact that sometimes predictions that are made with respect to election results using partisan vote indexes don't come to fruition. Is that right?
Sometimes they don't.
All right. Can you think of an instance with respect to either of the plaintiff's experts' reports that you reviewed where that was the case?
Yes, some of Dr. Chin's predictions did not come to fruition.
All right. And so let's take a look at that by pulling up Plaintiff's Exhibit 9, which is located in the back of your witness notebook.
Objection, Your Honor. I believe this is the I think this is the exhibit that was struck and excluded.
Your Honor, this is one of the plaintiff's exhibits. I believe they've already moved it into evidence.
That moment's consult, Your Honor.
Yes.
As to the exhibit itself, we have no objection. We will have an objection if they attempt to have the witness do what was excluded on the exhibit that was proffered.
All right. Well, so.
Go ahead, Ben.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Hood, what do you understand Plaintiff's Exhibit 9 to be?
So this is a figure from Professor Chen's expert report in this case of simulated house plans that he did. There are 1,000 simulations here, and this is a distribution after he applies a partisan vote index. And he also has what would have been predicted by the partisan vote index for the 2017 enacted House plan there, using the vertical red line to the left. So this is a distribution of 1,000 simulations. So if we had to make a guess, we would guess that there would be 46 Democratic seats, because that's the mode here, the most frequently occurring value in terms of these simulations. So Professor Chen's simulations would have predicted 46 Democratic seats. He indicates, using the partisan vote index, that the enacted plan should produce 42 Democratic seats.
And to be clear, the 46 Democratic seats that would be predicted, that is under a using non-partisan criteria, is that right?
It's using Professor Chen's criteria.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, he did not use partisanship to simulate the districts, that's true.
Now, where would the actual results of the election appear on this chart?
Objection. This is where now we're getting into the part that was excluded by the court's motion in limine. This is the work that was not done in his report, and that he had ample time to put in if that's the argument he wanted to make.
I would refer the court to page 14 of Dr. Hood's report, where he addresses Dr. Chen's methodology and makes a criticism of it, and makes a criticism of, specifically, he says, a critical point to remember, however, is that in using a partisan vote index of previous elections, one is relying on past behavior to make inferences about future behavior. Such a prediction about future events may or may not be borne out. In this case, we know from the 2018 election results that the results in certain House and Senate districts were not correctly predicted based upon a partisan vote index. And so I think we understand that the previous exhibit was excluded, where Dr. Hood drew another line on this chart, but I don't know why the testimony that he's going to give in response to this question is not consistent with what was covered in his report and disclosed to the plaintiffs in a timely manner.
Mr. Gersh.
Your Honor, the general point that counsel read is, of course, was in the report, and if he just wants to reiterate that, that's fine. But the court was presented with a motion to eliminate. The court ruled, and the court excluded this.
We're not using the exhibit that was excluded?
Go ahead. The objection, I think, is overruled, and we'll allow testimony on it from the witness consistent with, presumably consistent with what he reported.
Thank you, Your Honor. That happens to be all the questions I have about that with Dr. Hood, so we'll turn to Plaintiff's Exhibit 28.
Did you want an answer? I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, that's probably a good point. I got distracted in all of that. All right, I appreciate that. Dr. Hood, where would the actual results of the election appear on this chart?
It'd be over here on the right axis. We'd have to sort of extend it out here. The actual result would be 55 Democratic seats following the 2018 elections.
I think we now have exactly what was printed before, so I'm going to strike that.
So writing 55 on their exhibit is projection.
It's overruled. What he wrote on the board, or his verbal testimony, is what's been received by the court.
Okay, fair enough, Your Honor.
I just reverted back to classroom behavior. I'm sorry.
All right. Now, Dr. Hood, we're going to move on to Plaintiff's Exhibit 28. And I guess you might want to clean off the board there if you can clear it. If not, we'll move on. Your 55 is on top of Plaintiff's Exhibit 28 now. Is there a way to do that?
Yeah.
Can you figure out how to clear
Somebody's
All right, Dr. Hood, now that we've got a clean board here, Plaintiff's Exhibit 28, what do you understand this to be?
So this is a similar figure that was found in Professor Chen's report dealing with state Senate simulations. And again, what the results of his simulations were, what he would have predicted the Democratic seat share would be for the 2017 Senate plan using the partisan vote index after he drew his simulations. So again, the simulations would predict 20 Democratic seats in the Senate following the 2018 elections. He indicates that the enacted plan would produce 18 Democratic Senate seats, as indicated by the vertical red line there.
All right, and where do the actual results fall on this chart?
After the 2018 elections, there were actually 21 Democrats elected to the Senate.
looking at these figures, is there any scenario under Dr. Chen's purportedly nonpartisan simulated maps under which Democrats would receive a majority of seats in either chamber of the General Assembly?
Not according to these figures, no.
Now, going back to the tables in your report, I want to direct your attention to Table 10, which is found on page 16, and that is identified as Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 130. And what does Table 10 on page 16 show?
So Table 10 is a calculation of what's known as the seats to votes ratio. And so I've done some different calculations here again based on different groupings for the House and Senate. But the way this works is, again, it's fairly straightforward. It's a ratio literally of the seats won by a particular political party versus the votes aggregated across whatever geographic area we're talking about. So again, this was an issue raised by both the plaintiffs in the complaint as well as Professor Cooper in his report. So I wanted to do a little bit of work on this. So of course, if you have a ratio of 1.0 exactly, it means that the party in question's seats and votes exactly match. If the ratio is above 1, it means that the party is gaining more seats than they won in votes. If the ratio is below 1, it means that the party actually has fewer seats than the number of votes that they won. So statewide, the seats to vote ratio, and again, this is calculated for the Republicans, is 1.11 for the House. So that means the Republicans are winning more seats than they are votes statewide. But interestingly, if you divide it up into these different groups again, challenge districts, challenge groups, so any group that has a challenge district in it, and then non-challenge districts, a little bit different pattern emerges here. So it creeps towards 1. It goes down to 1.06 for the challenge districts, or 1.05 for any group where there's a challenge district. So it's closer to 1. And then it peaks back up to 1.23 for the non-challenge districts. So clearly the non-challenge districts, and what I mean by that is districts not mentioned specifically in the complaint, are pulling this figure up statewide above 1 to some degree. For the Senate, the statewide seats to vote ratio is 1.17. So again, the Republicans are winning more seats than they are votes. In the challenge districts, though, it's actually 0.99, so it's less than 1. So the Republicans in the challenge districts are actually winning fewer seats than votes. And then again, outside of these challenge districts, the figure, it goes up to 1.29. So it increases greatly outside of these challenge districts. Outside of these challenge districts.
So Dr. Hood, I want to make sure that I understand how you calculated these numbers. So taking the 1.11 number for the House, the statewide House seats to votes ratio for Republicans, you've got 2 percentages underneath that. Can you explain what those percentages are and how they were used to calculate the 1.11?
Right, so those are literally the seats and votes that I calculated. So you just divide 54.2 divided by 49.0.
That's the way you did the other ratios as well?
Correct. So it's a very straightforward measurement.
All right. In the next section of your report, which starts at the bottom of page 16, there's a heading entitled North Carolina's Political Geography. And I believe this section contains a map and tables related to that map for the rest of your report. So I want to pull up figure 1, which is identified as Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 131, and it follows page 17 in your report. Can you explain briefly how you created this map?
Okay, are we going to put these up side by side later?
And we can certainly do that. We can also go ahead and pull up, if it would be helpful, so you can talk about these both at the same time. Legislative Defendant Trial Exhibit 136 from your supplemental report. All right, and you can talk about these maps at the same time. How did you go about creating them?
So these are VTD level maps, and again, I acquired partisan election data and created a partisan vote index. For the map on the left, that's using a partisan vote index from 2010 to 2014 that comprised 11 statewide contested elections. And then later, when I turned in my supplemental report, I was able to get the 2016 VTD data and update the map so that the figure on the right is 2016 statewide contested races. I think there are 5 of them. So that's, again, they're both coded at the VTD level. So here, again, this is the Republican share of the two-party vote, goes from 0 to 100%. Here I've divided it simply into 0 to 25, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, and 75 to 100. So 0 to 25 would be right, dark blue, which would be strong Democrat. 25 to 50 would be Democrat. 50 to 75 would be Republican, and 75+% would be strong Republican, at least in terms of categorizing things. And I've color-coded the VTDs in this manner. And I've also included some geographic subregions which have been used in political science, political geography. I guess we could argue about these, but I didn't come up with these subregions, to sort of divide things up a little bit. Well, what you can see, if you know the side-by-side comparisons. So again, the first one is back in time a little bit, but what you can see just generally in either one of these maps is that there are more red-shaded VTDs than blue-shaded VTDs. So geographically, the Republicans in North Carolina have a much larger geographic footprint in the state. Now, it does vary by these geographic subregions. Democrats in both these maps are primarily confined to the largest extent to large urban areas like Charlotte, Raleigh-Durham, etc. There's also a heavy clustering of Democratic VTDs in the northeastern corner of the coastal plain region there, or subregion there. So interestingly, looking at the first map to the second map, again, the second map goes up through 2016, there are a larger spread of red VTDs and more VTDs that are shaded darker red in the latter time period than the earlier time period. So that's something else to note there as well. But this is just to give us a general sense spatially of where partisans reside in North Carolina.
Dr. Hood, did you have a chance in your supplemental report to determine how much of North Carolina's land area is covered by Republican versus Democratic VTDs?
Right. So again, this is based on square miles, not population here. So I just want to make that clear. But Republican VTDs comprise, I believe, 77% of the state geographically in square miles versus 23% for democratically coded VTDs. Yes, 77% and 23%. I just wanted to make sure I had that figure right. So that would be the calculation for the map to the right.
And if we could pull up next then Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 132, which is Table 12 in your initial report. And beside that, we also want to pull up Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 137, which is Table 3 in your supplemental report. And these charts kind of go together. Is that right, Dr. Hood?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you explain what they are?
So these are some statistics to give some numbers to the visual patterns that we're seeing. And I simply aggregated the partisan vote index at the state level and then within these geographic subregions. Again, for the earlier time period, you can see what they are. The partisan vote index at the state level is exactly 50% Republican, so that means it would be 50% Democratic as well. And then you can see there is a range within these subregions, going from 50% in the coastal plain region to 60.4% in the tidewater region. And then I've recalculated these for the later map using the 2016 vote data. The statewide partisan vote index there is 51.6%. And with the exception of the Piedmont, which really stays the same, there were slight increases in the Republican partisan vote index in these other subregions. Now, Moran's Eye, which you also see up there, is a spatial statistic which gets at the idea of clustering. Is clustering present? Are Democratic VTDs located next to other Democratic VTDs spatially? Are Republican VTDs located next to Republican VTDs, spatially speaking, geographically speaking? So a positive and significant value for Moran's Eye indicates that spatial clustering is present. So there is clustering of partisans, not surprisingly. Again, if we look at the maps, you can see the patterns with your eyes. And the spatial clustering from the earlier time period to the later time period actually gets stronger. And you can sort of see that with your eyes as well as you look at the pattern of partisanship from the earlier time period to the latter time period. So there's visual evidence and statistical evidence of spatial clustering in North Carolina, bipartisanship.
All right, and so let's turn then to another set of charts that relates to this map. And those are identified as Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibits 133, which is also Table 13 on page 20 of your initial report, and then Trial Exhibit 138, which is Table 4 on page 4 of your supplemental report. Those side by side. Dr. Hood, what do these two tables show?
So again, these are two regression models I ran to demonstrate, or to determine first, but now to demonstrate where the presence of Democrats are more likely to be located in North Carolina, and that's in urban areas. So what I'm doing is I'm regressing population density onto Democratic partisanship. So I've taken the partisan vote index and reversed it. So now 100 is 100% Democratic. And the relationship is statistically significant. So the higher the population density in the VTD, the more likely you're going to see Democratic partisans. So what this tells us, again, with that one exception in the coastal plain area in the northeast corner there, which can be fairly rural in that case, is that Democrats are highly concentrated in urban areas in North Carolina. So this is, again, just more empirical evidence of that.
All right, so I want to turn next to Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 140. And I want to ask you to take a look at, that's a 2-page exhibit. And I want to have you take a look at page 140-1 of that exhibit.
Okay.
Dr. Hood, how does this chart in 140-1 relate to the testimony you gave regarding partisan clustering in North Carolina?
If I may interpose an objection or a question through the court, I don't think we've heard a proffers that this has come from his report. And I may be wrong, but I don't recognize it.
This is another exhibit that we had marked ahead of time with our trial exhibits. It helps demonstrate his testimony. I believe it was the subject of their motion in limine, but it was not one of the ones that was excluded in the court's July 19th, 2019 order. And really, frankly, it's just an early disclosed demonstrative exhibit that further illustrates his testimony.
I don't believe this was included in the motion in limine, although our memories are not perfect on that score. I think it's just not something from his report, and my objection's on that ground.
Overruled.
All right. Dr. Hood, my question was, how does this chart relate to the testimony you just gave regarding partisan clustering in North Carolina?
Well, again, this is another sort of way to slice and dice and look at political geography in North Carolina. So if we could, there are two different panels here, one for the state Senate, one for the state House. And again, you can see the aggregated statewide vote there, 50.6% Democratic, 49.4% Republican. That's for the state Senate vote. And all this chart does is remove certain counties. Eventually, it will remove the 6 largest counties by population, and it demonstrates how the partisan vote changes if you take these counties out of the mix. So, for instance, if we took 2 counties out, so we have 98 counties left. If we take Mecklenburg and Wake County out, the Democratic vote share drops from 50.6 to 46.6.
I'm not even sure what I'm looking at, because I don't know what years this concerns. I'm not sure where they're calculating this from. And I think that's the problem with it not being in the report.
Mr. McKnight, if you could lay additional foundation for this.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Dr. Hood, did you create this exhibit?
Yes.
Okay, and how did you go about doing it?
Using the 2018 election returns from the North Carolina State Board of Elections.
And more specifically, how did you come up with these numbers? For example, the statewide numbers are 50.6% for Democrats and 49.4% for Republicans.
So I simply aggregated all the Democratic votes for state Senate seats statewide to come up with that number, and the same thing for Republicans.
All right, and then when you took out the 6 largest counties, how did you go about doing that to come up with the percentages you just testified on?
Well, I just made the aggregation without those 6 counties in the mix, so they're not included at that point. So the W/0 means without those counties. That's what the calculation would be.
And what year election results did you use to do that?
2018.
All right, Dr. Hood, I trust that will be sufficient for counsel.
Go ahead.
Okay, Dr. Hood, resume what you were saying about, I think you were talking about the Senate originally.
Okay, I was talking about the state Senate panel. So statewide, the Democrats won 50.6% of the Senate votes cast in 2018. If you take out Wake and Mecklenburg counties, it drops to 46.6%, while the Republican vote share is obviously increasing. If you take out the 6 largest counties, Mecklenburg, Wake, Forsyth, Guilford, Durham, and Cumberland, the Democratic vote share drops to 42.3% in those other 94 counties. So that's what we're talking about at that point, versus 57.7% Republican votes in those other 94 counties combined.
In terms of population, where do you understand the populations of Wake and Mecklenburg County to fall within the state?
Wake and Mecklenburg are the 2 largest counties in North Carolina by population.
And then what were your findings with respect to the House?
It looks similar. So statewide, the aggregated House vote was 51.2% Democratic and 48.8% Republican. If you take out Mecklenburg and Wake, the Democratic vote share in the other 98 counties goes down to 47.2%, and it rises to 52.8% for the Republicans. If you take out those 6 counties, the Democratic vote share drops to 43.1%, and the Republican vote share is 56.9%.
Thank you, Dr. Hood. And so I'd like to turn next to the next page of this exhibit, which is 140-2. Dr. Hood, number one, did you create this chart?
Yes.
How did you go about doing that?
In a similar fashion, I'm using 2018 vote returns for the House and Senate, the State House and State Senate. And instead of looking at counties, we're looking at what's going on within certain county groups here. Most of these are urban county groups, obviously. So in the House panel, for instance, in the Wake County group, the Republicans win 36.7% of the votes, but 0% of the seats, or 0 out of 11 seats. In Mecklenburg, the Mecklenburg County group for the House, the Republicans win 32.2% of the votes, but 0 out of 12 seats. And so that's how to read this chart. And so you can, similar thing for the Senate, For the Wake and Franklin County group in the Senate, the Republicans win 37.5% of the votes and 20% of the seats, or 1 out of 5 seats. So for these urban county groups, again, not counties necessarily, but county groupings in this point, you can see how these votes shift.
And this data is based upon the 2018 elections data as well?
Yes.
And you created these percentages using data from the State Board of Elections, is that right?
Yes.
Now, we were talking earlier about the supplemental report that you prepared. Beyond providing an updated partisan distribution map, what other questions did you address in your supplemental report?
So we've already covered the political geography section, as you just said, in the supplemental report. And I was asked to answer 2 other questions, which are listed on the first page of the report. Questions 1 and 3 in this case were not political geography questions. What was the incumbency re-election rate by party for the 2018 House and Senate elections? And what was the partisan distribution of the House and Senate following the 2010 and 2018 election cycles? So those are the other 2 questions I answered in the supplemental report.
All right, let's turn first then to Table 1 in your supplemental report. The supplemental report, again, is identified as Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 285. Table 1 also is identified as Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 134, and that's found on page 2 of your supplemental report. Now that we've got that up, what does Table 1 show?
So just to be clear, I mean, it states this in the report, but here I'm defining an incumbent as any office holder that was elected in 2016 who's running for a seat in the same chamber in 2018. There were some incumbent members that actually ran in a different district, but I still considered them an incumbent since they'd been elected in 2016. So just to be clear, so Table 1 looks at the House incumbent re-election rate in 2018. 94% of Democratic incumbents were reelected, and 88% of Republican incumbents were reelected. In the House, open seats that did not contain an incumbent member, they were completely open. The Democrats won 2/3 to the 1/3 for Republicans in the House. Table 2 looks at the same question for the Senate. The incumbent reelection rate for the Senate for the Democrats is 100%. For the Republicans, it's 76%, or 75.9%. In this case, the Democrats win 15% approximately of open seats for the state Senate, and Republicans win approximately 86%.
All right, so let's skip then to Table 5. I think we've already covered Tables 3 and 4 in your supplemental report. But Table 5 in your supplemental report is also identified as Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 139. What does Table 5 show?
So this is very straightforward. This just looks at the partisan seat distribution for the House and Senate following the 2010 election cycle and following the 2018 election cycle, just for comparison purposes here. So in 2010, the Republicans won 55.8% of the seats in the House and 62% of the seats in the Senate. In 2018, the Republicans won 54.1% of the seats in the House and 58% of the seats in the Senate. For Democrats, in 2010, the Democrats won 43.3% of the seats in the House in 2010, and in 2018 they won 45.8%. And the figures for the Senate are, in 2010 the Democrats won 38% of the seats in the Senate versus 42% of the seats in 2018 in the Senate.
All right, and Dr. Hood, after your supplemental report was submitted, did you become aware that the North Carolina Democratic Party had produced something called support scores that included an average support score for registered voters in each House and Senate district?
Yes. Now, can I say one other thing about Table 5
Sure.
before we move on?
Sure.
Oh, okay. So the answer to that question was yes. But going back to Table 5 for just a second, I think what's interesting about this is, of course, in 2010, the Republicans fared better under a democratically drawn plan. And in 2018, the Democrats actually fared better than they did in 2010 under a Republican drawn plan. So that's really the point of this table. Okay.
Thank you, Doctor. So, talking a moment ago about the support score issue. So, my next question would be, did you perform any analysis regarding the support scores?
Yes.
Okay. Could we pull up then Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 146? So, Dr. Hood, did you create Exhibit 146?
Yes.
How did you go about doing that?
I categorized we got a list of districts for the House and Senate and the average Democratic support score number for each one of these districts. So then I took that list and made my own categorization on whether the seat or the district would be strong Democratic, competitive Republican, or strong Republican. Again, based on, in this case, again, that plus or minus 5% from 50 being competitive. So a seat that was 45 to 50% on the Democratic support score would be competitive Republican. 50 to 55% would be competitive but Democratic. Then above 55% it would be strong Democratic. So I'm using the same categorization I talked about before. Things are just sort of reversed because this is a Democratic support score.
And what did you conclude with respect to the number of strong Democratic and Republican seats versus the number of competitive seats?
And I think we could use the word safe if we wanted to. I've used the adjective strong here. I think either one is fine. But it's interesting that using these Democratic support scores, there's an equal number in the House of safe or solid seats, 46 strong Democratic seats and 46 strong Republican seats. Now there are a few more. There are 21 competitive but Republican-leaning seats versus 8 competitive but Democratic-leaning seats. But there are a total of 29 competitive seats in all that theoretically, again, using a sort of a typical political science cutoff point, should be in play for either party.
And so let's turn then to Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 147. And Dr. Hood, did you create this chart?
Yes.
And how did you go about doing it?
Same way. This is for the Senate. Use the exact same formulation. And what we see here is, again, there's almost an even break between strong Democrat and strong Republican seats. There's 16 strong Democratic seats, 17 strong Republican seats, so almost even, not quite. There's 7 competitive but Democratic-leaning seats and 10 competitive but Republican-leaning seats. So 17 competitive seats altogether.
And what is your conclusion with respect to seats that are categorized as competitive?
Well, again, my conclusion would be that either party theoretically would be able to capture a seat in that range.
Now let's turn to Legislative Defendants Trial Exhibit 145. Now, Dr. Hood, do you recognize this exhibit?
Yes.
What is it?
So this was taking the election results from 2018 and using these categories we just discussed from the Democratic support scores for the House and Senate and looking to see how things shook out, basically. So the first panel there, I guess it's not I guess it's a table, although it's not labeled as a table, but the first panel there deals with the House. And again, we've got districts categorized as strong Democratic, competitive but Democratic-leaning, competitive but Republican-leaning, or strong Republican. So in the strong Democratic category, the Democrats won 100% of those seats. As well, the Republicans won 100%, 46 of 46 seats in the strong Republican category. The Democrats managed to capture 5 of 8, or 63% competitive but Democratic-leaning seats, and 5 of 21, or 24% of competitive but Republican-leaning seats. And then the second panel looks at the same exact rendering except for the Senate. Here again, it's interesting to note the Democrats win all their strong seats, the Republicans win all their strong seats. The Democrats win 5 of 7 competitive but democratically leaning seats, but they failed to win any competitive Republican seats. The Republicans captured all 10 of those seats.
All right. Dr. Hood, I think you've covered everything that we need to cover for now, so I have no further questions for you.
Okay, thank you.
Let's take a recess until 5 minutes till 4, and we'll resume the cross-examination. sorry. Is that yours or mine? All right, thank you. I need to tidy my space. Thank you. All right, cross-examination, Mr. Gersh.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Hood, David Gersh for the plaintiffs, we met at your deposition. Do you remember that? Yes, I do. All right. On your direct, you discussed the various legislative criteria that the legislature asked the map makers to follow, correct?
Correct.
All right. And I heard on direct you describe those criteria as creating a formulaic process, right?
Yes.
You said that they were fairly formulaic, that they really limit the discretion of the map drawer, right? You said that?
To a certain degree, yes.
You said in your report, you summed up by saying that the redistricting process in North Carolina is quite constrained, which greatly limits the ability of map drawers to create districts where partisan motives predominate. You said that, right?
Today?
In your
In the
report at page 9.
Well, if it's in the report, then I said it.
All right. Whatever the legislative criteria are, you've done no work to determine whether those criteria prevent the map makers from creating a partisan gerrymander.
What I can tell you sort of in reverse is that the criteria were followed, in my opinion.
Yeah, my question's a little different than that. You did no work to determine whether what you call these formulaic, fairly rigid criteria, you did no work to determine whether those criteria actually prevent the map maker from making a partisan gerrymander.
Correct. I didn't look at that.
And one reason is because you, Dr. Hood, you don't have any kind of definition that allows you to distinguish between a map that is gerrymandered, and when I use gerrymander to here today, unless I say otherwise, I'm talking partisan gerrymander. You, Dr. Hood, don't have any kind of criteria that allows you to distinguish between districts which are gerrymandered and which are not gerrymandered.
I have a classroom definition for gerrymandering. What, can you tell me how you're using the word gerrymandering in your question?
If you prefer, I'll put it to you this way.
Okay.
You don't have a method for determining whether districts have been drawn to create a partisan lean or haven't been drawn to create a partisan lean.
Correct.
There's no Dr. Hood methodology for determining whether there's partisan bias in a district.
Well, we talked about a measure of partisan bias that I used, the seats to vote ratio. I don't have a test myself, no.
Yeah, and that's true not just in the work you did in your report, but in all of your work, your academic work. There's no point where you've laid out a test. Here's how we determine whether there's a partisan bias.
I have not constructed such a test, no.
Right. So if the court determines that in deciding this case, it needs to know whether or not, regardless of all of those legislative criteria, the map maker went out and created a partisan biased map. That's not something you can answer for the court.
Well, you just said if the court makes that decision?
No, if the court decides that in order to determine the result in this case, it's going to need to the answer to the question whether the map maker was able to, notwithstanding the legislative criteria, was able to create a partisan biased map. That's not something you can answer.
No.
All right. And even though you don't have a methodology for determining whether districts are or are not the product of partisan bias, isn't it true that, in your view, the North Carolina enacted maps were drawn to favor Republicans?
North Carolina maps produce more Republicans than Democrats. True.
And your position is that as a general matter, the party that controls the redistricting process is going to make the maps advantageous to them.
I've always said in class and elsewhere that anytime a legislative body is drawing district boundary lines, there's going to be politics involved.
Well,
I don't think I've ever backed off from that point.
Yeah, my question was a little more specific than politics being involved. It's your view that the party that controls the legislative process is going to make the maps in their favor.
Yes.
And
But that may not rise to an unconstitutional level, for instance. I mean, that's not for me to decide.
All right, and in North Carolina, it's the legislature that makes the maps. The governor doesn't have a role in that, correct?
That's correct. The governor
Okay.
cannot issue a veto.
And when the maps were made in 2011, the initial map, and when the certain districts were redrawn in 2017, it was the Republicans who controlled the legislature.
That's correct.
And here, you know that partisan data is explicitly used to draw these maps.
I'm not denying that. It's in the criteria.
And let's put up, you put up Dr. Chen's exhibit. Let's put that back up. PX9, Dr. Chen's report. All right, you've seen this before, right? We just talked about it, you talked about it with counsel on direct.
Correct.
All right, and this figure shows that in the elections prescribed by the legislature, the 2010 to 2016 historical elections compiled into an index, the enacted map produces only 42 seats, and none of the simulated maps produce a result that low. 42 Democratic seats, and none of the simulated maps produce a result that low.
That is correct.
And in fact, the simulated maps, over 75% of them produce 46 Democratic seats or greater.
Yeah, adding that up in my head, that's about right.
And that's evidence that, this is on the House side, we're talking about House Simulation 1, that's evidence that the House map was drawn to favor Republicans, at least based on that historic election performance.
At least based on that partisan vote index, yes.
And now let's put up PX 37. This will be a figure from the Senate. It's actually simulation set 2, but it'll work just as well for these purposes. There, the enacted map, again, evaluated by the 2010 to 2016 historic elections, produces only 18 Democratic seats, whereas that result never appears in the simulation, correct?
Correct.
And the simulations produce 20 or more Democratic seats 75% of the time, or roughly in that order.
Correct.
And that, too, is evidence that the people who drew the enacted map were drawing a map in favor of Republicans, by which we mean it's designed to produce more Republican seats than would a neutral map.
Well, even, I would like to point out, either on the House figure or the Senate figure, even these neutral maps drawn without any partisan data, none of them would produce a Democratic majority, though. Not even any of Professor Chen's simulations would produce a Democratic majority in either one of these scenarios.
Dr. Hood, my question's a little different. My question is simply, Plaintiff's Exhibit 37 is evidence that the people who drew the enacted map were drawing a map that favored Republicans, by which we mean it is designed to produce more Republican seats than a neutral map would.
Favor in terms of producing more Republican and Democratic seats than these neutrally drawn maps, yes.
And it was designed for that purpose.
Well, that's intent.
Dr. Hood, recall that at your deposition you gave the following testimony. Question, this is about the same exhibit. And this too is evidence that the people who drew the enacted map were drawing a map that favored Republicans, by which we mean it's designed to produce more Republican seats than a neutral map would. Answer, yes. Same answers for the House. Yes, you agree? Answer, I agree with that statement you just made. Didn't you give that testimony at deposition?
Yes.
All right, you did some work that you put up, some of which was new, some of which was old. You did some work on the 2018 election results, right?
Correct.
You did some work with a partisan vote index, right?
Correct.
You did some work with a seat vote analysis.
Correct.
You did some work on challenged versus non-challenged districts.
Correct.
That's where at least you
Right.
described them as challenged versus non-challenged.
Well, again, my definition was which districts were mentioned in the
Specifically
complaint. In the
Okay.
complaint.
All right,
Yes.
but that's your description, but that's fine. And you did some work just generally on the election results, all for 2018, right?
Correct.
But what you did not do is compare the 2018 election in any respect with what neutral, nonpartisan maps would produce for that election.
I did not.
What you tried to do was to compare the 2018 results with what Dr. Chen calculated for based on the 2010 to 2016 historic elections. Isn't that right? That's when you wrote on the exhibit.
Correct.
And that's not an apples-to-apples comparison, is it?
Well, I'm comparing the actual results of the election to his prediction. He's using a different set of votes for those predictions. That's true.
Well, Dr. Hoffman's the guy who had to do the predicting. Dr. Chen doesn't call this a prediction, right?
Well, it's what would be predicted by his simulations to occur, I guess is the way. Not at a future point in time, just what would the simulations yield.
Sure, but all you're showing, well, John, those 2010 to 2016 elections, which are the elections picked by the legislature, those are elections in which the Democratic vote share is something like 47.9%, right?
That sounds correct.
2018, the Democratic vote share was higher than that.
Yes, it was.
Okay, so that's not an apples to apples comparison, is it?
Well, we're using different, I'm using when I drew that line up there, I said this is the result of the election, which is a different set of votes from what Dr. Chen used to make his, again, I'm going to call them predictions, or what the simulations would yield.
Okay, you made no effort to compare 2018 election results to 2018 neutral map results.
I didn't take the 2018 vote and reconfigure it into his districts, if that's what you're asking.
No, I'm saying
Well, I don't know what you're asking then at this point.
you didn't create a 2008 neutral nonpartisan baseline against which to compare the 2018 actual results. That's right, isn't it? You didn't do that work.
Okay, what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, you saw what Dr. Chen did. Dr. Chen took the 2010 to 2016 elections. He generated neutral, nonpartisan maps that he could then compare against the enacted map. You didn't do that for 2018.
I didn't do any simulations.
And so you did not create a neutral, nonpartisan benchmark against which to create the 2018 election.
I didn't create any of my own maps, no, if that's what we're getting at.
I'm getting at that you didn't create any neutral, nonpartisan benchmark against which to create the actual, against which to compare the actual results. That's true, isn't it?
Well, we have what Dr. Chen predicted through his simulations, and we have what actually happened. I mean, that's what I was looking at.
It's a simple question.
Well,
Dr.
I
Hood.
guess it's not very simple for me, so.
Well, Dr. Hood, let's try it one more time. Dr. Chen's work was looking at 2010 to 2016, right?
Correct. And that's the vote index he was using.
You did not create a neutral benchmark for 2018 against which to compare the 2018 actual election results.
Well, again, I'm going to say I did not run my own simulations and create.
Okay.
Okay, I can say that.
Well, and however, I don't want to get overly hung up on this, but you didn't create a benchmark against which you can make the statement, for example, that, well, let me word it this way. For all you know, the Democrats in 2018 would have done better had the elections been held with a neutral, nonpartisan map instead of the enacted map.
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation.
Overruled.
I don't think we'll ever know the results of that. I mean, we can't go back. I would say we can't go back and rerun the election under another map. I mean, we could formulate a map in the lab, so to speak, and apply different criteria. But at this point, I'm talking about the results of an actual election that happened. I mean, could that have could the scenario you're describing have happened? Yes. I don't think we can know that, though.
Well, that,
I mean,
one
that's
of
a
the,
counterfactual. We can't go back and rerun history.
Dr. Hood, all you need to do is to create neutral maps and see how that election played out. We have the voter data down to the VTD and maybe the census block level, don't we?
It can be disaggregated at the block level, yes.
Right. So, you would concede that you're in no position to say that in 2018, were there a neutral, nonpartisan map, the Democrats would have done better or worse than they did under the enacted map? You just can't make that evaluation.
Well, I think that's fair. I don't know what would have happened under another map.
You also said that at one point that the enacted map comports fairly well with the legislative criteria. Do you recall that testimony on direct?
Yes.
Okay. You said that, but in fact, one of the criteria was that racial data was not to be used in making the maps. Isn't that right?
That is my understanding from reading the criteria.
And you didn't look at whether Dr. Hoffler used racial data. Isn't that right?
I did not perform that analysis, no.
And when I showed it to you at your deposition, you said you hadn't looked at it. Isn't that right?
You showed me a spreadsheet that I'd never seen before. Is that,
At the time of your deposition, you had never seen Dr. Hoffler's use of racial data, that no one had provided that to you.
Objection.
I had not seen the document you presented.
Oh, well, what's the basis of your objection?
Well, he's making a statement with he's making an affirmative statement that Dr. Hoffler used race in drawing the districts, and I don't think there's any evidence in the case that that was true.
If you'd rephrase the question.
You were shown various documents from Dr. Hoffler's files that reflected the numbers of the black voting age population by district, correct?
Well, that was presented to me in that form, yes.
At the deposition.
Yes.
And if I understand your testimony now, you're saying you'd never seen that before.
Well, not before the deposition. I've seen it today, obviously.
No one had provided it for you to look at before the deposition.
Yes, that is correct.
All right. Even though it was in Dr. Chen's rebuttal report directed at your report, isn't that right?
Yes. I was focused on the enacted plan.
You had a chart. I just want to address a couple things quickly. You had a chart up there where you said you were taking the 6 largest counties out of North Carolina. You recall that?
Right.
If we took the 6 largest counties out of North Carolina, this would be an overwhelmingly rural Republican state. Isn't that right?
Much more rural, not completely rural, at least by Census Bureau definitions. So I can say more.
You put up a table 5. That was your work on incumbents. Isn't it true that you included in that chart incumbents who had already announced that they were retiring?
On the incumbency reelection rate chart, those were individuals who were running for office again.
Yeah, on table 5, where you talked about the people who I think couldn't avoid being paired, some of those people had announced that they were retiring, isn't that right?
I believe some of them did, yes.
But you included-
I couldn't pinpoint them for you sitting here now, but yes.
But they're included on the chart as people who couldn't be avoided being paired, or people who weren't avoided being paired.
Oftentimes when someone's paired in a legislative race, one of the incumbents does retire.
You referred to, you talked about support scores during your direct testimony, you recall that?
Yes.
All right. Isn't it true that the support scores are just scores of individual voters?
I got a very sparse description with the data. A paragraph.
Okay.
Yes, I think they are based off of categorizing individuals probably in a voter file. But if you aggregate those individuals, you have the complexion, the partisan complexion of the district.
Well, you say that, but in fact, they're not used to assess districts, are they? The support scores are not used to assess districts. That wasn't in the paragraph you were given.
Well, that wasn't in the paragraph. To be honest with you, these were scores that apparently came from the state Democratic Party in North Carolina. That's my understanding. I couldn't tell you everything that they use these scores for or don't use these scores for.
And you also understand that the scores are for all registered voters, right?
Right,
They're not for likely voters.
right. I understand that.
And,
But they did a fairly good job of predicting a lot of the races.
well, regardless of whether they did or didn't, these certainly, they're not part of the legislative criteria, right?
That is correct.
Dr. Hoffler certainly didn't use them, right?
I guess not.
You can't point to anyone who's ever used those support scores to assess how a district is going to vote.
I would suspect somebody at the North Carolina Democratic Party is using those scores.
Well, you say...
They're probably paying a lot of money for those scores.
Well, that's different than the question I asked. As far as you know, there's no one who's actually using those scores to assess how a district is going to vote.
I don't know of any conclusive evidence that someone used those scores to make predictions.
And as a political scientist, you think if you had to assess how a district or a group of districts is going to vote, you'd be much more interested in how likely voters were going to vote than how registered voters were going to vote.
Well, yes, if I could get that information.
And in fact, if we looked at registered voters, you would see that unlike likely voters, registered voters in North Carolina are heavily Democratic, right?
There's a plurality of Democratic registered voters. Yes, not a majority in the state.
But more than the Republicans.
Slightly, yes. There's a whole bunch of unaffiliateds as well.
You say it's only slightly more, but the registered
It's
Democratic...
more. I've looked at the figures. I haven't looked at them recently.
Okay. All right, but in any event, there's no literature, there's no work that you produce that says support scores are the way to assess how a district is going to perform in the election.
No.
All
I've
right.
not published anything on support scores.
Let's talk about political geography. You put up some maps, you put up is it called Moran's? A Moran's ratio?
Moran's Eye.
Yeah, all right. And you say there's some natural clustering by party, but you're not saying that your work on political geography means that Dr. Hoffler couldn't produce a gerrymandered map, are you?
What I'm saying in my work on political geography is that the Republicans, I think it's pretty easy to see, have a much larger geographic footprint in North Carolina.
Well, they take up more, they're in more places, if you will. but-
Well, I said geographic footprint.
Sir, if you just let me finish my question, but the place where the Democrats are, which tend to be the urban areas, those produce more districts, right?
Yes, I'm not talking about population.
Okay, so let's go back to political geography. Isn't it true that your work doesn't say that the political geography can explain the partisan bias in these maps?
I didn't say these, I mean, those are, to be fair, those are your words about a partisan bias to the maps. I'm not saying political geography explains the redistricting package in total, but it has an effect on things.
But you haven't tried to figure out whether political geography can explain the kind of Republican lean that we saw in the two charts of Dr. Chen that we looked at the beginning of your testimony. You haven't done that work.
Well, I did the work that I reported on in court here today and in my reports, so that some inferences can be drawn. I haven't gone further than that, though, if that's what you're getting at.
Well, if we can just focus on my question, I think it's one step further on than what you've answered. You haven't done any work to suggest that political geography can explain the Republican lean of the enacted map, the kind of lean we saw in Dr. Chen's work. That's not what you do, is it?
Well, I certainly use political geography.
I didn't ask that.
Well, you said that's not what don't I do, I guess, is what.
You did not try to answer the question of whether the Republican lean in the enacted map can be explained by political geography, did you?
No. I'm
And-
making some inferences.
And that's exactly the kind of work that Drs. Chen and Dr. Mattingly and Dr. Pegton did. That is, they looked at whether or not political geography could possibly explain the extreme partisan results that you see in the enacted map. Isn't that right?
Well, that's encapsulated in their simulations.
All right, thank you. You've testified before, correct?
Correct.
You testified most recently in the Ohio A. Randolph Institute versus Householder case in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Ohio.
Correct.
And that was a challenge to Ohio's congressional redistricting plan.
Correct.
And you testified for the defendants.
I did.
And the court criticized your testimony.
The court had some things to say, yes.
The court specifically said that you had made some inapt comparisons, right?
The opinion speaks for itself, if that's what it says.
That is what it says, isn't it?
Well, I don't have it in front of me.
Sure, let's put up
Okay.
Plaintiff's Exhibit 1017. Go to page 43. If you look the third line in, here the court's talking about your testimony. We can draw some limited inferences from his testimony and report that due to some inapt comparisons, I'll go further, unexplained and apparently meaningful exclusions of certain elections in his partisan indices and admitted failures to account for certain confounding variables in some of his analyses. They're talking about you in that case, right?
Well, my name's right up above there, so yes.
And they ruled for the plaintiffs, isn't that right?
Yes, at the district court level.
All right, and let's turn, you also testified in Veazey versus Perry in the Southern District of Texas.
Yes,
That was a voter ID case,
correct.
and the court there said that it finds Dr. Hood's testimony and analysis unconvincing and gives it little weight, isn't that right?
Something like that.
Do we need to see that one again, too?
Can I take your word for it?
Certainly can. You testified in Democratic National Committee versus Reagan in the United States District Court for the District of Arizona, isn't that right?
It had a different name.
It was a voting rights case.
Yes, it was.
And the court said, for a number of reasons, the court affords little weight to Dr. Hood's opinions. Isn't that right?
I don't have it in front of me.
All right, let's put up
Okay.
Plaintiff's Exhibit 1012. All right, there's a description of who are there, and then it says, for a number of reasons, the court affords little weight to Dr. Hood's opinions. Is that right?
Yes, that's
And
what
then
it
they go
says.
on to discuss all the reasons they give your opinion little weight. Isn't that right?
I don't think it ends there, no.
All right. Well, let's go on to the next case. You testified in Common Cause versus Billups in Georgia State Court. Isn't that right?
Yes.
That was another
Not federal court.
federal court. I'm sorry. Versus Billups. In any case, that was a challenge to Georgia's photo ID law. Voter ID law.
That is correct.
All right. And the court found Dr. Hood's absentee voting analysis is either unreliable or not relevant to the questions the court must resolve. Isn't that right?
Yes.
You testified in Ohio Organizing Collaborative versus Husted in the Southern District of Ohio, federal court.
Correct.
And in that case, there were several challenges under Federal Voting Rights Act and constitutional law to changes in Ohio's Voting Act. Isn't that right?
Absentee balloting, yes.
Yes. And the court said of your testimony, it affords those opinions little weight. Isn't that right?
Yes.
You testified in Bethune-Hill versus Virginia State Board of Elections in the Eastern District of Virginia. Isn't that right?
Yes. More than once. Yeah.
You testified for the legislative leaders who were interveners in that case.
I believe that's correct.
The court stated, we do not credit Dr. Hood's testimony for several reasons. Isn't that right?
In the second iteration, yes.
You also testified in the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless versus Houston.
Well, I think we already talked about that
Now,
case.
this is a different one.
Well, I don't remember the previous case then, unless it was called something else.
Well, let's put up this case.
Okay.
Let's put up Exhibit 1016. And let's go to page 47. Court there said, in sum, Dr. Hood's testimony and report were in large part irrelevant to the issues before the court and also reflected methodological errors that undermine his conclusions. Other courts have found likewise. As such, the court finds his contribution of limited value. That was about you. Isn't that right, sir?
Looks like it.
Let's go to, you testified in Common Cause versus Rucho in this state, right?
I did.
All right. Plaintiffs, that was a federal gerrymandering challenge to the congressional map.
Partisan gerrymandering.
Yes.
Yes.
The plaintiffs called Doctors Mattingly and Chen as experts in that case.
Yes,
You were one of the experts called on the other side, correct?
I was.
And what the court said is that legislative defendants have not provided any persuasive basis for calling into question Dr. Mattingly's and Dr. Chen's methods, findings, and conclusions. Isn't that right?
Something like that.
And they said specifically about you, legislative defendants expert belies any argument that natural packing explains the 2016 plan's discriminatory effects. You remember that, isn't that right?
Yes.
All right. One more. I think we're up to 10. You testified in Frank versus Walker in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Wisconsin. Isn't that right?
Yes.
That was a challenge to Wisconsin's voter ID law.
That is correct.
And the plaintiffs called Mr. Leland Beatty. Isn't that right?
I believe so. It's been a while.
And the court wrote, I give greater weight to Beatty's conclusions than I do to Dr. Hood's. Isn't that right?
I believe it was something like that, yes.
All right, let's put that up. Exhibit 1014. All right, if we can go. Therefore, I give greater weight to Beatty's conclusions than I do Hood's. Hood there is you, Dr. Hood, right?
Yep, that's me.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Cross-examination by intervening defendants. The state.
No.
Redirect.
Yes, Your Honor, just a few questions.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Hood, earlier you tested in the cross-examination, plaintiff's counsel brought up plaintiff's exhibit 37 and was asking you questions related to how the map was designed. Do you remember that line of questioning?
Right.
And in response to one of those questions, you made a statement, well, that's intent, and then you got hit with another question. Can you explain or elaborate further what you meant by that and what you understood that line of questioning to be about in your deposition?
Well, my understanding is that was about some kind of standard that I did not enunciate for what is an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander. I don't have my definition for partisan gerrymandering is drawing district boundary lines to gain an unconstitutional partisan advantage. How do you define that? I don't know. That's for a court to define. So to me, that's talking about intent at that point.
Is that something that you got into in this case?
No.
You were also asked about a number of cases in which courts provided commentary on your testimony just a moment ago. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay, so the first case you were asked about was the Ohio A. Philip Randolph case. Now, Dr. Hood, are you aware that that case, the decision that counsel referred to, has been stayed by the United States Supreme Court?
That's my understanding.
You were also asked about another case called Common Cause versus Rucha.
Correct.
Do you remember that case? Now, you were asked about the district court's assessment of your opinions in that case, right?
Correct.
Now, is it safe to say that the U.S. Supreme Court didn't think much of the trial court's analysis in that case because they reversed and remanded that case and ordered the plaintiff's claims dismissed? Is that right?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained as to the characterization of what the Supreme Court taught.
Well, fair enough, Your Honor. Is it your understanding, Dr. Hood, that the Common Cause versus Rucho trial court decision was vacated and remanded to the trial court with instructions to dismiss the plaintiff's claims?
Yes, it's my understanding it was vacated, yes.
Okay. How about the Frank versus Walker case? Was there any subsequent history on that case?
Reversed by the Seventh Circuit.
All right. And the Common Cause versus Billups case. Now, that was the first case that you testified in as an expert, right?
Correct.
And you were testifying on behalf of the Common Cause plaintiffs, is that right?
Correct.
And is that the only case in which your testimony as an expert has ever been rejected?
Yes. I've been tendered as an expert in approximately 20 other state and federal court cases, and I can just say that sometimes courts give more weight to my analysis and sometimes they give less weight to my analysis. But I've been accepted as an expert in every other case.
All right. No further questions for you today, Dr. Hood.
Thank you, sir. You may step down.
Thank you.
Your Honor, you're here to defend this call by Michael Barker.
Yes, sir. If we could have a few minutes, or a minute really is all we need.
Well, let's go ahead with this since our time is short. And if you want to prepare a list, perhaps compare that, provide it to the other parties, and then we can do it all as a group first thing in the morning.
That'll be fine, Your Honor. Thank you very much.
And Your Honor, if I may, I'll take these witness finders we'd like to
Yes, sir.
now.
Please remain standing, sir. Place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you?
Yes.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Michael Barber, B-A-R-B-E-R.
Branch.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Barber. Can you
Good
please introduce yourself to the court?
My name is Dr. Michael Barber.
To orient the court, we intend to offer Dr. Barber as an expert in American political science with a focus on the topics of ideology and partisanship, geography of voters, and the analysis of election results. Dr. Barber, can you actually turn to tab 1 in your binder, which is Intervenor Defendants Exhibit 99? Do you recognize this document?
Yes, this is the report that I prepared for this case.
And is this the report that you understand was served on April 30th, 2019?
Yes, that's correct.
And can you please turn to tab 2 in your binder? And this is Intervenor Defendants Exhibit 98. Do you recognize this?
Yes.
And what is it?
This is a copy of my CV.
Thank you, Dr. Barber. Let's talk a little bit about your educational background. Where did you go to college?
I have a bachelor's of arts in international relations with an emphasis in political economy from Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah.
And when did you receive that degree?
In 2008.
After you received your Bachelor of Arts from BYU, what did you do next?
I began a master's in public policy program at Brigham Young University as well.
And did you finish your master's at BYU?
No, I didn't. I completed 1 year of the program and then left to begin a PhD program at Princeton University.
When you left to attend the PhD program at Princeton, did you apply to other universities besides Princeton?
I did. I applied to a number of other PhD programs. I was accepted to a few of those at MIT, University of California, San Diego, Princeton, and Duke University as well.
Did you receive your master's at Princeton?
Yes, I did.
And when was that?
That was in 2011.
And what did you do after you received your master's?
I continued in the program to complete my PhD.
And what was your PhD dissertation on?
The dissertation was broadly related to the issue of campaign finance in American politics.
And did you receive any awards in connection with your dissertation?
Yes, my dissertation was awarded the 2015 Carl Albert Award for the best dissertation in legislative politics, and that award is given by the Legislative Studies Association of the American Political Science Association.
With regard to your master's and PhD studies at Princeton, did you take any classes involving political ideology or partisanship?
I did. I took a number of courses broadly related to the study of American politics, of which political ideology and partisanship are a large component of the study of American politics.
And a similar question with regard to the geography of voters. Did you take any classes in your PhD and master's studies related to the geography of voters?
Yes, so again, courses in American politics would cover topics such as the political geography of voters. We talk about urban politics, rural politics, state legislative politics, various topics like that.
And did you take any classes involving the methodologies of analyzing election results?
Yes, as well I took a number of courses in statistics and quantitative analysis of political science or social science data, of which election results are some of the most common forms of quantitative data that are used to, are analyzed in American politics. And so in those courses, we would have used and analyzed election results on a number of occasions. Beyond that, in the courses, the more substantive courses about American politics, much of the research that we would have discussed would have used and analyzed election results, and we would have then analyzed and critiqued those papers as well.
Obviously, this lawsuit is about redistricting. Was redistricting discussed in any of your master's or PhD classes?
Yes. So in classes in American politics, the process by which district boundaries are drawn, the institutions that are used to make those decisions would be discussed. There's a variety of research on that topic. As well, there's a variety of research that looks at the effects of redistricting on a whole host of political outcomes, things such as how redistricting affects voter turnout, how it affects political polarization, topics like that.
I'd like to move on to your current work. Where do you work now?
I'm an assistant professor at Brigham Young University.
And how long have you been there?
I started in the fall of 2014.
And do you do anything else for BYU as part of your responsibilities as an assistant professor?
I'm also an affiliated faculty member with the Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy.
And are you on tenure track at BYU?
Yes.
And where are you in the tenure track process?
My portfolio will be evaluated this coming academic year.
Generally speaking, what are your duties and responsibilities as an assistant professor in the politics department at BYU?
So my responsibilities can more or less be divided into three different categories. The first would be teaching. BYU is a primarily undergraduate university, and I teach a number of different courses to undergraduates in the department. The next responsibility I have is under research, and so there's an expectation that I'm continually conducting research, taking that research and putting it into academic outlets in the form of journal articles or book chapters and things like that. Finally, the third responsibility is I have a number of administrative responsibilities in the department.
Can you talk to the court about the different types of classes that you teach?
Sure. I've taught 3 different classes a number of different times at BYU. The first class is a class about Congress and the legislative process. In that class, we cover a variety of topics related to legislative politics, both at the congressional level, but we also talk about research at the state legislative level as well. We talk about electoral politics, but also the internal politics of legislative bodies as well. The second class that I teach is a seminar course in which students read and critique current and contemporary research in American politics. And in that class, students are also expected to develop their own hypotheses, to collect data and analyze those hypotheses, and then write those analyses up into original research papers. And so I help the students throughout the semester in the process of creating those original research papers. The third course that I teach is a class on statistical analysis. And so in that class, I'm teaching students the basics of statistics from the introduction of what data are, how to analyze them, simple summary statistics, but then the course moves further into regression analysis, topics of correlation, covariance, and a variety of other topics in quantitative methods.
And are you teaching any of these classes next semester?
Yes, next semester I'm teaching 2 sections of the quantitative analysis course and 1 section of the upper division seminar course.
And can you describe for the court some of the academic research that you've been performing in connection with your assistant professor work at BYU?
Sure. So I have published a number of peer-reviewed articles. On my CV, you can see those listed on the first and second page. There are 15 of them. And these articles cover a variety of different research interests, issues of political ideology, issues of campaign finance, various topics on electoral politics, some research on survey research methodologies, political polarization, those types of topics.
Now, what is the Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy?
The center is an organization at BYU that serves to promote faculty research in the study of American politics, but also to connect faculty with students who are also interested in conducting research. There are a number of affiliated faculty. Most of the affiliated faculty also study American politics. And then there are a number of students who are affiliated with the center, and faculty and students work together to help students develop research papers, but also to comment and offer suggestions for one another's research as well.
What is your role with the center?
As an affiliated faculty member, I attend our regular meetings, read and comment on my colleagues' work. I work with students affiliated with the center, offering mentorship and assistance in their own research questions as well.
Now turning back to your CV at tab 2 of the binder, Intervenor Defendants, Trial Exhibit 98, does this document accurately describe your education and experience?
Yes, it does.
This document was provided as part of your expert report to opposing counsel on April 30th, 2019. Is there anything that has happened since April 30th, 2019 that the court should be aware of?
I think I mentioned in my deposition that the first available working paper, campaign contributions and donors policy agreement with presidential candidates, that paper has since been accepted for publication. And then I would just note on the last page of the CV, it's listed that I was an expert witness in a federal case in Florida, and I've since testified in trial in that case.
And this is on page 5 of your CV?
That's correct.
And the case you're referencing is Jacobson v. Lee. Is that in federal court in Florida?
Yes.
And is that the first case that you've ever provided trial testimony in as an expert witness?
It is, yes.
And do you remember the topics for which you were accepted as an expert witness by the court?
I believe the topics were broadly in American politics, the study of campaign finance, and I think there was a third, but it's escaping my memory at the moment.
Could it have been the use of quantitative analysis in political science?
Yeah, that sounds right.
All right. Do you remember what the case was about?
The case is about the order in which candidates' names appear on the ballot in Florida.
Thank you, Dr. Barber. Now, can you please describe some of the journals in which your political science articles have been published?
Sure. So these are peer-reviewed academic journals, and by peer-reviewed, I mean that before an article is published in any of these outlets, it goes through a very lengthy process by which it's submitted to a number of anonymous reviewers, between 3 and 5 typically, and those reviewers evaluate the work, critique it, offer suggestions, determine the novelty and importance of the findings, and then give recommendations to the editors of these journals as to whether they believe the articles should be published or not. Most often the articles are not accepted for publication. In most of these peer-reviewed journals, the acceptance rate is 5%, maybe 10%, but in the top journals in political science, the acceptance rate is extremely low.
And do any of your peer-reviewed articles involve questions about ideology and partisanship, geography of voters, or the analysis of election results?
They do, yes. Taking each topic in turn, I have a number of articles about political ideology, just pointing the court to number 14 is an article titled Conservatism in the Era of Trump that's forthcoming at a political science journal. Article 11, Does Party Trump Ideology? Disentangling Party and Ideology in America. That article was recently published in the American Political Science Review, which is broadly seen as our flagship journal in political science. Article number 9, Who is Ideological? Measuring Ideological Responses to Policy Questions in the American Public, also deals with the topic of ideology. The second topic of political geography, the article number 2, Online Polls and Registration-Based Sampling. That's an article that develops a new method for pre-election polling, and the method uses statewide voter files. We use those to geolocate voters throughout the state, and we then sample those voters based on a model of their probability of turning out to vote. We then use the addresses that are contained in the voter file to send them letters that invite them to participate in a survey online. And so in that way, we're very concerned about the geographic distribution of voters and making sure that we have an accurate sample of voters throughout the area that we're interested in surveying. Another paper that deals with political geography that has yet to be published but is in the list of working papers is on page 3 at the very top, estimating neighborhood effects on turnout from geocoded voter registration records. And in that paper, again, we're using statewide voter files to geolocate voters and then calculate statistics about their neighborhoods, basically the area right around them, both in terms of the partisan composition, but also the electoral environment and other factors. And we then look to see how their neighborhood composition impacts the way that their propensity to vote. In that paper, we use statewide voter files in California, in Florida, and in North Carolina as well. And then finally, on the topic of the analysis of election results, I wouldn't necessarily point to any particular article simply because nearly all of these articles in some way deal with electoral politics. There's either as an outcome variable in which I'm trying to project or predict particular factors that influence elections, or as a variable that I'm using to see how elections influence other behavior as well. And so most of these articles in some way or another are connected to electoral politics.
Has any court ever declined to qualify you as an expert witness?
No.
And to be clear today, are you testifying as, or would you be testifying as an expert on the physical geography of the state of North Carolina?
No.
And before today, have you ever been to North Carolina?
I've been here a few times, yes.
Have you ever taken any classes specifically focused on North Carolina politics?
None specific to North Carolina. I've taken a number of courses in American politics and studied topics of state politics and state legislative politics in general, of which North Carolina would certainly be a case.
And do you believe that the fact that you do not have extensive personal experience in North Carolina, or that you do not have a North Carolina specific education, prevents you from rendering accurate opinions in this case?
No. It's my belief that the data and analysis that are being used here are in some cases identical to the data and analysis that I do in much of my research. But beyond that, are very similar to the type of analysis, the type of data, and the type of inferences that are drawn in the research that I have done more broadly.
And finally, are you offering an opinion in this case regarding where specific district lines should be drawn?
No.
Your Honors, we would ask to tender Dr. Michael Barber as an expert in American politics, specifically on the topics of ideology and partisanship, the geography of voters, and the analysis of election results.
Any objections?
No objection, Your Honor.
Legislative defendants
Oh, Your Honor.
and the state? All right. His testimony will be received as proper.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Dr. Barber, how did you become involved in this case?
I was retained by intervener defendants in the matter.
And what were you asked to do in connection with your engagement?
I was asked to evaluate and comment on a report produced by Dr. Cooper.
How long were you given to review and analyze Dr. Cooper's report and to prepare your own report?
Approximately a month, slightly less.
And did that time frame in which you had to prepare your report undercut in any way the credibility of the opinions that you expressed either in the report or today?
No.
Have you reviewed Dr. Cooper's trial testimony in this case?
Yeah, I have, yes.
And have your opinions in the report changed since you issued it on April 30th, 2019?
No, they have not. I would note there was one statistic in which I had the incorrect number of legislators in the state Senate by one, and I've since adjusted that number.
And can you generally describe the information on which you relied in preparing your report and preparing to testify today?
Sure. I relied on the report produced by Dr. Cooper, the data and analysis that he conducted, and then beyond that, I use a number of different sources of data, primarily from different government agencies. So some data that I use come from the U.S. Census Bureau. Other data, particularly with reference to election results, are coming from the North Carolina State Board of Elections. And then there's some other data that I used in preparing and producing the report from published academic work on topics related to this.
And do you believe that the information you relied on was accurate?
Yes.
All right. Dr. Barber, I believe you testified a moment ago that your assignment in this matter was to provide the court with your opinions regarding certain conclusions reached by Dr. Cooper in this matter. Is that right?
That's correct.
And what is your understanding from a high level of the opinions reached by Dr. Cooper?
So it's my understanding of Dr. Cooper's report that he reaches a variety of different opinions. The first is in connection with the ideology of the electorate in North Carolina. And it's my understanding that he comes to the conclusion that the electorate in North Carolina is quite moderate. The second opinion that he offers is that the legislature of the state also has a history of moderation, with the exception of the present day, and that his view is that the current composition of the state legislature is that it's quite conservative. And then finally, my understanding of his opinion is that there exists a disconnect between the view of the electorate and the ideological composition of the state legislature, and that disconnect is, in his view, due primarily to the process of redistricting.
And can you summarize for the court the conclusions you reached with regard to your analysis of Dr. Cooper's opinions?
Certainly. So it's my view that many of the conclusions that Dr. Cooper draws are coming from data that simply don't allow us to make those conclusions. Some of the data that he uses, as I'll explain in a little bit here, simply don't speak at all to the ideology of the electorate. Regarding the composition of the legislature, I think that Dr. Cooper doesn't consider the historical composition of the legislature, which I think speaks a lot to the way the legislature looks today. And then finally, I think he overlooks alternative explanations for why any disconnect, if one exists at all, might be present.
Your Honor, I think this is probably a good place to start tomorrow morning.
Yes, sir. All right, so we will recess for the afternoon. I'm assuming you've talked amongst yourselves so that we can conclude this matter by 5 o'clock tomorrow. I know you've been keeping track of minutes, seconds.
I think the court has made it plain that if we don't conclude it by 5 o'clock tomorrow, we will not have a panel to listen to.
That's well said. Very good. We will then be in recess until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And I know we still have exhibits to deal with, but you all work that out, and we'll talk in the morning about that.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you all.
Superior Court's in recess until 9 o'clock.
We can just keep arguing.